My name is Kevin Howard, and welcome to Breadcrumbs, a podcast for people who know it's not working. So, this is episode 3. In episode 1, I talked about where are we in America today? And I distilled it down to 5 major points. We re-elected Donald J. Trump. We are experiencing the worst housing affordability crisis in U.S. history. We have experienced the second anniversary of Hamas's terrorist attack against Israel that led to the Israeli government response, which is a genocide in Gaza. We have entered the 4th year of the war in Ukraine. And finally, I discussed the climate crisis that now we act as if is not a real thing. So that was episode 1. Episode 2, amongst all this whirlwind, this pulp fiction that we're living in modern society, where are we? Who are we? And so I endeavored to answer the question, who am I? And hopefully through that introspection publicly, it inspired you to take a good look at who you are. And once I looked at that, then I tried to answer the question, what can we do as individuals when all the problems that seem to be pressing on our lives seem too big to solve? So in episode 3, what we're going to talk about is, how did we get here? How did we arrive in this moment? We can't determine where we would like to go. We can't discover the breadcrumbs that are going to remind us of how to get home if we don't know how we got lost in the first place. So this episode, we're going to examine, how did we arrive to the moment where we have reelected Donald J. Trump? Okay. So I will say, without burying the lead, we got here because both establishment parties, owned by extremely wealthy people in our society, have intentionally betrayed the American people. Now, this is a story that can be told best through the lens of 4 establishment presidential administrations: the Clinton administration, the George W. Bush administration, the Barack Obama administration, and the Joe Biden administration. Now, don't worry, I'm going to talk about Donald J. Trump's first administration, and I'm going to contrast the Donald J. Trump we just reelected, right? But it's important so that you see the story, you see what the establishment has done, you see what the adults in the room have done to us that led us to Donald J. Trump, okay? But we will examine Trump because he is the anti-establishment expression. In fact, the only anti-establishment politician that we've had an opportunity as an American electorate to choose from when it comes to the general election. So let us begin. 1992. I know some of you did not experience 1992. Some of you view 1992 as a history lesson, but many of us actually experienced it. For me, in 1992, I was in my first year of law school, and it was a truly remarkable election, because in this election we had the incumbent president was George H.W. Bush, was running for re-election. We had Bill Clinton, the governor from Arkansas, was running to be the new president. And we had Ross Perot. And so for the first time in generations, we had a third party, a legitimate third party candidate. Ross Perot was a billionaire who made his money in oil. He was from Texas, and he was self-funding his campaign, and he shook up the whole shebang, right? And so it was a very exciting election. But this is where the nation really got introduced to Bill Clinton. And Bill Clinton presented himself as a man of the people, as a man of the working class, because he was. He was raised by a single mother in rural Arkansas. He was the man from Hope, literally Hope, Arkansas. Right. This was this was the working class of the country, who actually, in a modern context, not Abraham Lincoln time, not the 1900s. This was the working class of America in modern America, raising through the ranks. Yale, Oxford, Rhodes Scholar, poor boy gone good, presenting himself as one of us, going to the White House. But what made him duly attractive to many of us was that because he grew up white and poor in rural Arkansas, he lived very close to the Black community and had built a deep relationship with the Black community. In fact, the running joke, for those of you who didn't go through it, was that Bill Clinton was our first Black president, taking nothing away from Barack Obama. That was the way he was presented. I mean, to give you the definitive example on that grounds, Bill Clinton, as president of the United States, went on the Arsenio Hall show. Now, Arsenio Hall was a comedian, a Black comedian, and he had a late night show. And it was, it was a Black thing. It wasn't everyone was invited, but it was certainly very much speaking to the Black community. This is the Arsenio Hall show. And the president of the United States, if you could wrap your brain around it, went on the Arsenio Hall show with his shades on, and he played the saxophone, and he blew it up. He did great. You would have think he was in a jazz club. That's how Black Bill Clinton was able to be, right? And it was authentic, and we loved him. So let me just say up front, I voted for Bill Clinton twice. In fact, when election day 1992 occurred, again in my first semester of law school, in my ground floor apartment, I hosted an election party for Bill Clinton. Well, hopefully it was going to be for Bill Clinton, but we didn't know because Ross Perot was shaking it all up. Okay, and so he won, and it was a celebration. And I was so inspired by his acceptance that night, that I wrote him a 10-page letter, handwritten letter, mailed to the White House, got a response. It was the rubber stamp. It wasn't a personal response, but it was a response from someone in the White House office of this new president. But my appeal to him, because he was so articulate, because he was so inspirational, because he was a man of the working class, of which I came out of the working class. I too was raised by a single mother. Right. Working class. Okay. I wrote him and I asked him to restore the civility of our political discourse, of our social discourse, that it had been soiled through what we thought at the time was a vitriol that Ronald Reagan had initiated. This notion that there were real Americans and then there were not real Americans, and that the difference between the real Americans and the not real Americans was that we disagreed on policy. I was asking Bill Clinton to reintroduce the American tradition, which was that honest Americans who love the country can disagree on solutions for the country, and that disagreement did not suggest that they didn't love the country or they didn't share the same values. That was something that, to be candid, Ronald Reagan introduced back into American politics. And by the time 1992 came along, it was really a thing. And so this was the optimism that I entered into as a person who voted for Bill Clinton in 1992 and in 1996. So when I say what I'm about to say, understand where I came from. Okay. All right. So what did Bill Clinton do? This was the promise of Bill Clinton. He was one of us. So the first major thing he did, and it was an extension of what he had done in Arkansas, is he reformed welfare. Okay. So coming into 1992, what we had in America is we had communities around the country that were participant in institutional welfare, institutional public support. This was a remnant of the New Deal, where FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, had established a permanent safety net in America, right? Because we needed it. Great Depression was horrible, right? Okay. So we had a permanent safety net, right? And so Bill Clinton said, no, he came from that point of view that that part of the permanent safety net is it apparently encouraged people to stay poor. Of course, I never bought into that, and I never met a poor person. And I was born and raised in the Bronx, so I knew quite a few who ever felt that way. But it was a growing movement in the country that somehow the fact that the safety net was there and wouldn't go away would encourage a person not to work. This was sort of Reagan's and H.W. Bush's, welfare queen, legendary urban legend stuff, right? So here Bill Clinton came into office as one of us, and he established national welfare reform. And it was sold as this idea that, okay, you know what? Instead of you staying on welfare for the rest of your life, you're going to have 2 years. We're going to help you for 2 years. But during the 2 years, we're going to give you the skills to go get a good job, to make more money than you would have made on welfare. But now you're generating it as a person who is contributing to society. It builds your self-worth and it benefits the society. Win-win. Okay, so it sounded, this was Bill, this was us, right? Okay, so he did welfare reform. Now, the problem with how he did welfare reform is we went light on the training. We went light on the road to earning a living that was better than you would have earned on welfare. What we effectively did was simply kick you off welfare after 2 years and left you to find whatever you could find, right? That was the primary effect. And so Bill Clinton's welfare reform pushed more children into hunger, off food stamps, than any policy in U.S. history up to that point. Okay. So that's the first thing. Right. Then the next thing he did was campaign to ratify NAFTA. And he traveled the country and he thoroughly supported the North American Free Trade Agreement. This was the movement started in the 80s, Reagan, George H.W. Bush, the conservatives, right? The free market folks, right? This was a movement. This was a liberalization of international trade that was going to allow free trade, as in no tariff trade, between multiple countries, which would free U.S. multinational corporations to search the world for the lowest cost, best quality labor they could find to produce their goods, which then would produce the same quality goods or better quality goods at a lower cost. And then theoretically that would translate to us, right? We get these great goods for a lower cost because, right? No. Okay, so we passed NAFTA. And that's how he sold it. That this was going to lead to far more jobs, millions of jobs. Just trust us. That's how it was going to happen. Okay. But what happened is, first and foremost, the multinational corporations leapt at that. And they gangbusters using the third world labor and labor where trained labor in countries of lower cost with very little to no environmental regulations, right? To produce the goods and services at a lower cost and then turn around and sell them at a premium, sell them like they were made in America, paying American wages with American benefits, right? No, they would sell it at a premium in the American market, producing a massive profit. That's how that turned out. And the flip side of that is it deindustrialized America. So the manufacturing jobs, the textile jobs, the jobs that the non-college educated middle and working class that had built the greatest middle class and working class in US history between 1950 and 1980, right? When the working class used to be able to buy a home and send their kids to college, AKA Archie Bunker, Every Man, All in the Family, Norman Lear, go check it out. This used to be America. Okay. Well, Bill Clinton, in ratifying the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, accelerated the process of liberalizing international trade, which allowed US manufacturers to shop the globe for the lowest costs, lowest regulated, environmentally regulated markets to minimize the cost of the high quality products and services we sell, and then to turn around and sell it back into our market at a premium with no tariffs. So that was all of their profit. And the flip side is all the jobs that non-college educated Americans were doing that earned the best money went away. And instead of investing in upscaling, like with the welfare reform program, instead of investing in upscaling the American labor, basically left them to their devices. And what did job training do? Well, by the way, we all know how bad health costs go up, medical costs go up. Right? With the highest inflationary costs through the 90s and into the 2000s was education, both at the collegiate level and a vocational level. The inflation there was extraordinary. Why? Because people desperately needed that and they wound up getting priced out. Okay, so here's NAFTA, deindustrialized America. Okay, that's okay. That's the next thing he did. Oh, but he's just getting started, and we're still in the first term. Then we have the 1994 crime bill that was sponsored by none other than Joe Biden, Senator Joe Biden from the great state of Delaware. Not being facetious, great state of Delaware, but Joe Biden co-sponsored, if not sponsored, the 94 crime bill. And the focus of the 94 crime bill was to protect women. The Violence Against Women Act was within there. That was the focus, that was the calling card. But embedded in the 94 crime bill was a mandatory sentencing guideline scheme that dramatically increased the prison sentence of repeat offenders, non-violent repeat offenders. Okay. So we passed the 1994 crime bill. So that we understand what impact. By the time Bill Clinton left office on January 19th, 2001, the 94 crime bill effectively doubled the prison population in the United States. Yeah, yeah. No president in US history. Line up every one of the law and order presidents, because all of them, I'm just being candid, all of them got topped by Bill Clinton and Joe Biden's 94 crime bill, right? He put more Americans, the prison population doubled to 2 million people in prison. And the bulk of the new people were non-violent criminals, or how about this, non-violent offenders on protracted sentences, extended sentences. Yeah, the 94 crime bill. Okay. So we're still in the first term. Right? Okay. All right. So then, all right. But he goes on. 96, re-election time. He passes the Telecom Act of 1996. It sounds innocent enough. This is the bit of legislation that allowed extreme wealth to consolidate their ownership in telecommunications, which means radio, TV, cable, newspapers, all forms of media. You want to know why why Jon Stewart by the 2000s made a fortune on Comedy Central, right? Showing how all these talking heads in establishment media are reading from the same script. I mean, story after story after story. Jon Stewart would show, right? How they're repeating the same thing. How is that possible? Because the same people own them. So you want to know why we're so misinformed and how easy it is to misinform us? Here it is. Bill Clinton passes the 1996 Telecom Act that allowed them, forget about, monopolies. Let's get in the way of the party for the extreme wealthy. And there it went, the 96 Telecom Act. Okay. But he is just getting started. It ain't over yet. But before we continue, I gotta back up a little bit. Because the last thing of the first term that he got started. And now this is going to be something that happened on the state level. So you're going to say, well, hold it, he can't control state legislation. Okay. What I'm about to describe, okay, there's something called the Uniform Commercial Code. And it is a standard piece of contract legislation that is on the state level in all 50 states. And the reason why, okay, it is historically, it is uniform, the Uniform Commercial Code, but it's passed at the state level so that commerce across the country had basic rules, standard rules of how contracts, what are your rights under contracts, provisions. There was a standardization. Now, of course, it could have been done on the federal level, but this is how the Uniform Commercial Code was developed. So starting in 1994, and it lasted from 1994 through the rest of Bill Clinton's administration into George W. Bush's administration between 1994 and 2004. And believe me, this stuff doesn't happen without the support of both establishment political parties. The Uniform Commercial Code in all 50 states, I mean, we're talking Mississippi and California. Now, other than being in the United States of America, there's not a lot of similarities. Other than there being humans in Mississippi and humans in California, there is not a lot of similarities. But amazingly, there were two changes made to the Uniform Commercial Code in both Mississippi and California and all 50 states. And what are those two changes? The first major change was okay, it used to be when we bought stock. When we bought stock, they would actually send us the certificates, right? But the stock is held and traded by a brokerage firm, right? Okay. But our interest, our ownership of the stock we bought was personal property. So if for whatever reason the broker who was holding our shares to trade, was trading our shares and stuff like that, right? If they went out of business, retired, whatever they did, bankrupt, right? We would get a phone call, or we would give them a phone call and say, okay, send our securities, send our assets, we own it, over to another firm of our selection, right? Okay. Well, the first change they did was they converted our personal property right to the securities that we own. Instead of it being personal property, it became a claim on the value of the security. So whatever the security is worth, if the security is selling for $100, we bought it, it was selling for $100, now it's selling for $150 because we've held it for 5 years or whatever. We have that claim, whatever it's worth, against the security. That's our interest. It's no longer personal property. Okay. What difference does that make? Well, you're going to find out. The second thing they did, and again, this is in all 50 states. Now, wrap your brain around that, is they said the people who hold our assets, the people who hold our securities, the brokerage, right? There's lots of entities that are involved in the system that hold our securities, hold our assets that we buy with our money. Okay. The Uniform Commercial Code gave them the right to take out financing and use our asset as collateral. Oh yeah, I didn't stutter. They get to use our asset as collateral. Well, here's the thing. You get to use our asset as collateral. So, if you have 401k and you have assets, you can borrow against it. What that did was create a situation legally where our securities can be used by multiple parties as the same form of collateral. By the way, this is a part of the shenanigans that makes up what's called the derivatives market. Yeah, the finance people, the Wall Street types, yeah, they get a yeah, yeah, yeah. This is the shenanigans that's in that area. And so this is one of them. So the people who hold our securities because they're supposed to, because they're required to, because they have the licenses to do trades, have the ability to take out debt against our assets. Okay. So that started under Bill Clinton. And as I said, it can't get done without the president is the head of the party that he's a member of and the opposition. Believe me, Mississippi wasn't Bill Clinton country, right? Alabama wasn't okay, right? But all these states changed those two things. So hold that back. Okay, so Bill Clinton started that process. George W. Bush finished it. As I said, this is a story about how the establishment screwed us. Okay, here we go. All right. So now we're back into 1996. Wall Street says, we have finally gotten our guy. We finally have someone because FDR, the signature regulation established by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the greatest president in American history by most historians. I mean, Abraham Lincoln is right, but FDR, okay. How he restored confidence in the banking system after the banking failure, the run on banks after the stock market crash of 29 and all that, right? How he said, okay, we're going to create a classification of banks called commercial banks, right? Where people put their money in. And we're going to separate them from the speculative banks, investment banks, and from speculative financial services companies like Breadcrumbs, right? Insurance or whatever. These things are going to be separate. And for the commercial banks, we're going to have us, the federal taxpayer, insure the deposits so that up to a certain amount. And this is what built confidence. People were willing to put their money back into the bank because in the event that the bank failed, commercial bank, right, the insurance would replace their deposits. So now it restored confidence. But the linchpin of doing that is these commercial banks could not then take our deposits and just invest them in highly speculative things. So in exchange for federal deposit insurance, FDIC, right? Okay. In exchange for that security that the taxpayer was given to deposits in commercial banks, banks submitted to a level of regulation. And one of those regulations is that commercial banks can't engage in investment banking, speculation, all types of high risk things. And they can't use our deposits to invest in those things. Okay. Well, okay. That law is called Glass-Steagall. And it is the signature regulation that FDR established that reestablished confidence in the US banking system that served us from the 30s all the way through the 80s, deep into the 90s. But for people on Wall Street, it was the bane. It was the thing that had them shackled. It was the mother of all regulations. They hated it. And conservatives from the Eisenhower administration through Richard Nixon, through Ronald Reagan, through H.W. Bush, I mean, in their wildest dreams, they wanted that regulation gone. Wall Street finally found their man with Bill Clinton. Yeah, a Democrat. FDR was a Democrat, right? Okay. So Travelers Insurance and Citigroup decided this is our moment. So they decided to come together and merge. And their merger produced the largest financial services firm in the world. Okay. Right. Which was completely illegal under Glass-Steagall. Insurance, commercial banking, investment banking, no. Sorry, fellas, can't do it. Now, under the legislation, the Congress has 1 year to do like they did to Ma Bell. Break them up. Okay, all right. For those of you who don't know, Ma Bell, that's telecommunications, back when we used to break up monopolies. Okay. I digress. So here we go. So Congress had 1 year. Now, Travelers Insurance and Citigroup is not stupid. They would not go through the cost and the market reputation of merging if they didn't know that Bill Clinton is their man. That Bill Clinton is not going to let the Congress break up the largest financial services company in the world. And they sure didn't. So yeah, like on cue, the United States Congress repealed Glass-Steagall. So if we could just mark this moment for all you historians out there, the person who ended the New Deal in America, the person who ended the permanent safety net in America, the person who ended the signature financial regulation that restored confidence in banking, that made Wall Street possible again, okay, was President Bill Clinton, the man of the people, one of us. Okay. And you would figure, after you've done this, after you have topped every conservative Republican in modern history, because this is what they wish they could have done. They couldn't, if they woke up thinking such a thing, they'd smack themselves in the face because it was so impossible that a Democrat did it. Okay, well, here we go. He's not done yet. I mean, I cannot express this. So Bill Clinton's second term ends on January 19th, 2001. And on January 20th, normal constitutional, George W. Bush is going to be sworn in. Well, on December 29th, 2000, it's called the lame duck session of Congress, right? Bill Clinton signs into law. The Congress passes, and Bill Clinton signs into law. And I got to read this title. It's called the Commodity Futures Modernization Act. Okay, so for a parting gift, it wasn't bad enough that repealing Glass-Steagall. For a parting gift, he passes the Commodity Futures Modernization Act. So yeah, for us, what? Let me tell you what this does. This is the legislation. Well, the phraseology you may have heard, for those of you somewhat in the know on these things, is that this is the regulation. This is the legislation that deregulated complex financial instruments. Now, that's a lot of words that don't say much to most people. But let me give you an example of what we're talking about. Those derivatives that I told you in the case of the UCC code, now the people who hold our shares can place a lien on our collateral, even though we are empowered to place a lien on our collateral, and they can do it without even telling us. Those kind of things, that kind of shenanigans. Yeah, this is the kind of stuff that's in the derivatives market, which allows you to make multiple bets on the same assets, multiple bets on the same risk. The most famous example that we have learned bit us right in the butt is called a credit default swap. Right? And so once again, without going into a master's class in finance, right? Because they do this complexity thing. That's the new con, by the way. Right? Okay, without having to go that deep into the weeds, imagine walking down the street in your neighborhood and you find the most feeble-looking, unhealthy-looking person, and you take out an insurance policy for $1 million. You could take it out for any amount of money, as long as you're willing to pay the premium on their death. Okay, right. You can't do it, right? First and foremost, because you have no interest you can't take out insurance on something that you don't have an interest in, right? That you're not relying on their earnings and then they die. Yeah, if you're married, if that's your parent and you're a child, yeah, those are cases where insurance are appropriate because you have a loss that you were legitimately relying on, but you have no interest in the stranger. Well, with a credit default swap, which is an unregulated insurance policy, right? You could take out a bet on any risk that you have nothing to lose in. And if that risk occurs, you get paid the face value. The only thing is you have to pay the premiums for it. The insurer in this case would still price the risk and say, okay, you're going to have to pay this premium. Okay. Well, that type of shenanigans, the credit default swap, right, became legal because of the Commodity Futures Modernization Act, amongst other things. We'll be talking more about that. So this was Bill Clinton's parting gift. And then what does he do? Bill Clinton came on the scene because telling us he is from rural Arkansas. He's from Hope. He's the man from Hope. Does he go back to Arkansas after he leaves the White House? A lot of people go back home. I mean, Nixon went back to California, right? Okay. No, Hillary's from North Chicago. Do they go back to Chicago? None of these big time? No, 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 no. Where they go is the man of the people, the man who played sax on Arsenio Hall, the first black president in U.S. history, quote unquote, goes to set up shop in Harlem, New York. Harlem just happens to be north in Manhattan of Wall Street. So the man of the people, the man of the black people, on top of everything else, goes to Harlem and is embraced like a hero, notwithstanding the fact that no president, along with Joe Biden, put more people of color for nonviolent crimes in jail than any president in U.S. history. Forget about that. He goes to Harlem. And it doesn't take Wall Street but a few years to fund up the Clinton Global Initiative and to hand the Senate seat in New York State in 2002 to Hillary Clinton. Yeah, this is how bad the establishment screwed us, right? So Wall Street absolutely rewarded Bill Clinton, and Wall Street was absolutely the funders of the Democratic Party after Bill Clinton was done. Okay, so that's Bill Clinton. January 20th, 2001, George W. Bush raises his hand. So who's George W. Bush? Okay, this time I didn't vote for him, but I certainly know a lot about him. Interesting story. George W. Bush was presented to America and the American people as a compassionate conservative. Right? This was a person who understood diversity, who had a positive relationship with the Hispanic community, like Jeb did in Florida, right? He was from Texas. That he was someone who progressives and liberals could work with. He was a compassionate conservative. That was how he was introduced to the country. So, but the funny thing about it is, okay, so he had a razor thin majority in the Senate. He had a majority in the House, but he had a razor thin majority in the Senate. It didn't take him by the summer of 2001, before 9/11, to lose the Republican majority in the Senate because he was so vitriolic that he lost that Jim Jeffords, the senator from Vermont. This is when there were liberals in the Republican Party, was so mortified by the vitriolic approach, as a social conservative. I mean, that was the thing. What drove George W. Bush's compassionate conservatism was he was a believer of Christ. This was a born again evangelical Christian in the White House. George W. Bush established at a cabinet level position the office of the office of faith-based initiative. Okay. That the federal government was going to look into ways within the context of the Constitution to support faith-based activities around the United States. George W. Bush introduced that. Okay. And so, but the methodology by which he tried to build coalition was not compassionate at all. In fact, it was so vitriolic that it chased Jim Jeffords out of the Republican Party, threw his hat in with the Democrats, and they had the Senate majority. He lost his majority in the Senate. It took him by the summer. Okay. Then he goes on, and now we have 9/11. Now, I'm going to do a whole podcast on 9/11. But for the sake of this conversation, right, we had an intelligence failure, as we came to learn, because of the 11 intelligence agencies. They each had various forms of information, right, about the terrorists and the planning of the terrorists and the training to learn how to fly aircraft and all this stuff. We had it in different agencies, but none of the agencies used the same system, so they didn't talk to each other. And so there was a lack of coordination, and so we didn't catch them, and 3,000 Americans died on 9/11. Okay. And George W. Bush went to the towers, the crumbled towers, and said, "We will avenge this," and told us that they hate us for our freedom. Okay. And so, not to let a tragedy go to waste, right? He initiated, and again, this is the compassionate conservative. He initiated what's called preemptive war. Okay. Preemptive war means that if you think a country is going to attack you, and it's going to sound familiar in a minute, you got to attack them first. Okay. And so the whole argument with the war in Iraq was that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction. And their intent is once they get to a point where they can attack us, they will attack us with those weapons of mass destruction. And if we did not stop them, the mushroom cloud that we would see over America would be the result. And so on. So that was preemptive war. But if that didn't make war permanent enough, the idea that you can attack a country because you think they're going to attack you, he initiated the war on terror. He legalized and codified the war on terror and got the Congress to pass it. And they did, right? Okay. So what's significance about that? Well, okay, the whole Geneva Convention that governs the rules of war amongst sovereign countries, right, is to craft a legal framework that makes war limited, right? So it's involved with countries, and those countries have territories. And as soon as and they have governments, and as soon as you cause the government to give up, that's when the war ends. And that if the place where you fight the war is the territories of the countries who are fighting, right? It's not everywhere in the world. In the war of terror, the war against terror is where the battlefield became everywhere, and the duration became forever. Because whether it was Al Qaeda who was associated with 9/11, right? The tactic of using terror to influence policy, right, would go on. It wouldn't end with Al Qaeda. And it hasn't ended with Al Qaeda. Okay, so he created the groundwork for the forever wars, and we started with the war in Iraq. And Colin Powell went to the United Nations and sacrificed his integrity before the world by declaring that we had the evidence that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction. And this is kind of personal for me because I served for Colin Powell when he was Lieutenant General, leading Fifth Corps in Europe, in NATO, in the 80s. So this is personal. This man has integrity. Most of us believe he has integrity. But the greatest blight against his integrity was his speech at the United Nations on behalf of George W. Bush, justifying the reason why the United States was going to use preemptive war, which is not legal under the Geneva Convention, right? Preemptive war because of Iraq's imminent threat of attacking us first. Okay, and there we went. And we know how that turned out. We know it wasn't for long that we found out that Iraq did not possess weapons of mass destruction. Now, check your history book, or if you went through this like I went through this, see if you found anywhere, even when George W. Bush left office, whether anyone, Cheney, any of them, admitted that they were wrong. Any of the people who voted for it, for the war, who authorized it, like Joe Biden, like Hillary Clinton, right? See if any of them ever admitted that we were wrong, that we made a mistake, that they didn't possess, that the reason for the preemption, that they possessed weapons of mass destruction and we had to stop them before they attacked us, was untrue. Oh, no. Oops, nothing happened here. But on that basis, how many Iraqis died? On that basis, we caught and hung Saddam Hussein. No fan. But we had no basis for doing it. Right. Okay. So this is, okay. So that is, the permanent war established by George W. Bush. Preemption, we get to attack them because we think they're going to attack us. Boy. And warned her. I just want to remind you of something. This is the period of time that America now lives in former President Eisenhower's nightmare. So this is a moment where I'm going to ask you to go to YouTube and put in Dwight Eisenhower's final speech to the American public. I believe it was in 1961, that January, before your President Kennedy raised his hand on January 20th, right? Where he warned America of the danger of the military-industrial complex. And he said that the military-industrial complex was dangerous. To run the economy through the military-industrial complex was dangerous for democracy, because our policies would be driven by the interests of that complex. And the thing is if the only way to make money through war is you got to have an enemy, well, by the time of George W. Bush, now we have the permanent war, preemption, and the war on terror. That war could be fought anywhere against anyone forever. Okay. So, if that's not enough, if you are, let's look at the levels of betrayal. So, George W. Bush was an evangelical Christian, and the evangelicals largely supported him because he was a born-again Christian, right? He started the faith-based initiative at a cabinet level position. And one of the most famous evangelicals at the time was a gentleman named David Crow, who was a deputy director, right? Who, after a few years, left office, and he wrote a tell-all book going back to the community, saying that George W. Bush and Dick Cheney and the leadership of the Bush administration use Christianity as a way to get our support, but they actually just have contempt for us, have no interest in actually codifying the Christian faith in U.S. policy and U.S. law. No, it's just a tool. And he left completely heartbroken about what his experience was with the born-again Christian George W. Bush. Check it out. Check out his book. Poor David, he's passed. He had brain cancer. He passed away. But the fact is the book is a matter of public record. Okay. So that's from the social conservative perspective. Okay. If you are a fiscal conservative who believes in small government, who believes that the management of the government needs to be efficient, that the use of our tax dollars needs to be efficient, that the role of government should be only where necessary, right? Okay. So we had 9/11. We had a systems and information systems failure, a classic argument against big government Democrats. You had 11 intelligence agencies. All of them had information. None of them talked. None of them talked. The nation got attacked. 3,000 Americans died. So what would a conservative do? They were in government, right? Oh, did they make the intelligence community efficient? How about just talk to each other? No. They created a new massive government agency called the Homeland Security Administration. Yeah, you would have thought you would have thought Ted Kennedy, you'd have thought the biggest big government liberal must have been in charge after 9/11. But no, George W. Bush created the Homeland Security Administration, which was massive, massive. Okay, right? All right. And what he did was what he demoted FEMA from a cabinet level position. He did that like coming into office. And once he created the Homeland Security Bahamas, he buried FEMA underneath it. If you want to know why FEMA ain't your grandfather's FEMA, ain't your father's FEMA. Yeah. Look, they barely can get into the room with the president in the basement of the Homeland Security Administration. Okay. And the rest is history because Hurricane Katrina demonstrated just how we had destroyed FEMA with bureaucracy. And this was by a conservative Republican. It's supposed to be a small government efficient, right? No, no. Totally catastrophic. And if you just want to compare apples to apples and see how different FEMA used to be, okay, I served a full year as a FEMA lead disaster assistance loan officer for the Northridge earthquake natural disaster in California from 94 to 95, January to January. And oh, by the way, right? Okay, compare that to Katrina. You just go and check it out. All I could say is that the when you look at the extent to which people were restored to any semblance of wholeness after the disaster, we created American refugees with Katrina, Hurricane Katrina. We sent people from Louisiana all over the country to, instead of rebuilding their homes and their lives back where they live. We didn't do that to California. We didn't do that to the southeastern United States in Hurricane Andrew in the late 80s, early 90s. I mean, we didn't. We knew how to do disaster relief until George W. Bush came along and buried FEMA in the basement of the Homeland Security Administration. And then FEMA became politicized. Because, oh, by the way, the governor of Louisiana during Hurricane Katrina was a Democrat. And the governor of Mississippi, the border state, next state over, was a Republican, Haley Barbour, right? Take a look at how the effectiveness of FEMA in a Republican state versus a Democratic state. That we didn't do it. We didn't do business like that before. We did not do business like that before. We didn't politicize, disaster relief in U.S. history. We weren't doing that. All right, okay, but this is George W. Bush. This is how he expanded government. Oh, and he wasn't even done yet. Before he ran for re-election, or as he was running for re-election in 2004. Now, all of you have heard of Medicare Part D, the prescription drug benefit. Okay. I bet you just assume that since Medicare is the program supported by the Democrats, that the prescription drug benefit was established by the Democrats. I just want you to know. This is what you know. That Medicare Part D was passed by the Republicans and signed into law by George W. Bush in 2004 over the objections of the Democrats. And why? It was $1 trillion boondoggle for the pharmaceutical industry. How? Because it had amongst the most poisonous of the poison pills was Medicare is the number one consumer of pharmaceutical drugs in the United States because it's insuring seniors, right? The prescription drug benefit made it illegal for Medicare to negotiate bulk purchase prices with the pharmaceutical industry. Just let that sit in for a second. Okay, the number one consumer. So a free market example of this is the relationship between Walmart and Coca-Cola. How many units of Coke products do you think Walmart sells every month? Now, if we passed a law that said Walmart had to pay, could not negotiate bulk purchase prices from Coca-Cola, what would that do to the profitability of Walmart? Okay, it's really obvious. This is how free markets work. But the Republicans said, oh no, we're going to take prescription drugs, which are not cheap. This ain't soda pop. And we're going to make the number one consumer of prescription drugs pay the premium, not be able to negotiate bulk purchase prices. By the time George Bush left in 2008, or January 19th, 2009, it added $1 trillion in debt. Look, that feature alone. Okay. So this is another massive government program passed by a conservative Republican. Okay. Is there any wonder why the Tea Party voted in conservative in grassroots conservatism? Why it was not inspired by Obama. It was inspired by the absolute fiscal nightmare of George W. Bush. And you can consolidate his record in the eight budgets he had. Seriously. When he took office, or his first budget, how about this? September 30th of 2001 was Bill Clinton's last budget, ended that day. And George W. Bush's first budget was on October 1st, 2001. Okay. And his last budget was September 30th, 2009. That's just how it works. Right? Okay. On September 30th, 2001, federal debt was like $5.8 trillion. By September 30th, 2009, it was like $11.9 trillion. He literally doubled the federal debt. So, okay. So from a fiscal conservative perspective, the magnitude of betrayal, blowing up FEMA, creating the Homeland Security Administration, a new government agency that's huge, thousands of employees, not making intelligence efficient, creating a boondoggle with the prescription drug program over the votes of the Democrats. Check it out. Oh yeah, and for all of you who thought Paul Ryan was speaking truth to power, check out the fact that he voted for that. He voted for the poison pill, right? So that he could turn around and say, we can't afford Medicare. Yeah, this is how these people act. Okay. So now we're coming to the end of George W. Bush's presidency. And the chickens have come to roost. Why? Because Wall Street is blowing up. We will have a episode on what led to the financial crash, the Great Recession, in 2008, 2009. That's a whole story. But for the sake of this story, we do know, as a matter of public record, that Lehman Brothers had to file bankruptcy in September. We know that Washington Mutual and Bear Stearns went bankrupt in the spring. We know that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac had to be taken over by the government in the summertime. Right. Okay. All these things were happening. And there was a national presidential election. Senator McCain was running against Barack Obama. Okay. But things really came to a head in September 2008. Now, context. The election is the first, November 4th, 2008. That's the election. Historically, politicians don't change a postage stamp in an election year that might throw votes one way or the other. But here we are, 2 months before a national presidential election. Right. And Lehman Brothers files bankruptcy. And all hell done broke loose. Big meeting with Bush's chairman of the Fed, Bernanke, Hank Paulson, Bush's Treasury Secretary. We have to bail out the banks. The banking system is about to collapse. We have to bail out the banks. Okay. We need $700 billion because there's a trick we can do. We're getting to that too. But we need $700 billion 2 months before a national presidential election, when a third of the Congress is running for re-election and so many of the senators. Okay. So we're beyond the postage stamp. So we need $700 billion to give to Wall Street. Okay. You can't make this up. Well, first thing, what happened the first time they tried in September, Congress said, you are out of your mind. And why? And maybe this was a moment where actual conservatives demonstrated the integrity that they really have. We believe in free markets when you're conservative. I'm a fiscal conservative. I'm a social liberal, but I'm a fiscal conservative. We believe in free markets. If you invested stupidly, if you made errors in the market will punish you. Welcome to the party. So if the banks took on undue risk, yeah, some of them may fail. And the ones who did not will rise up and take their place. And that's what happened in the stock market crash of 29. That's what happened in the Great Depressions of the 1890s, right? Every time wealth makes stupid mistakes and the country pays the price for it, they suffer too. That's how it works. Well, that's how it works in a free market. Yeah, not this time. So Congress said no, led by the majority of the Republicans, because it is an anathema to fiscal conservatism, to free market capitalism, to bail out risk takers. The reason why risk takers get all the profits when it works is because when it fails, they pay all the prices. Not this crowd. No. So the Republicans in the Congress, said, no, we're not going for this. And enough of the Democrats said, we're not going for this. And why should we help George W. Bush when his popularity is in the 20s? His popularity was in the 20s by this point, by the way, lowest in U.S. history. So they didn't pass it. And the stock market, the Dow Industrials dropped 777 points in one day. Oh, it was gone. It was on. This thing was going down. So Barack Obama suspended his campaign. You remember? He suspended his campaign, presidential election, and went back to Washington. And then John McCain did the same thing. We got to save the nation. We got to save the nation. And they got in those back rooms. And they cleaned up. I didn't see the blood. But all I know is the next time around, they did pass it. But who passed it? The establishment Democrats joined hands with the establishment Republicans and passed the $700 billion TARP legislation to bail out Wall Street. That means Barack Obama and John McCain voted yes, along with Nancy Pelosi. Yeah, yeah. See, this was a glimpse at the fact that the establishment Republicans, the neocons, and the establishment Democrats, the neoliberals, W. Bush, Cheney, Paulson, Bernanke, Mitt Romney, yeah, on the conservative side, neocons, Clinton, Obama, Biden, Kamala Harris, on the Democratic side, are all on the same team when it comes down to it. Because they all supported TARP. Okay, so that's fine. So we saved the economy, we saved the banks. But the American people were being catastrophically devastated. Because what was going on at the same time, the reason why the banks were failing is because millions of people were foreclosing on their homes. Millions of people were losing their homes. Millions of people were losing their jobs. Pension funds had invested in the Wall Street AAA rated securities, and they were losing their pension funds. So if you were a pensioner who worked 40 years in some steel mine somewhere, and you get $2,800 a month, you found that your pension got knocked down to like $1,200. This is the kind of pain we're talking about. Many people lost their jobs, their savings, their credit, their marriages, their homes. Yeah, complete catastrophic failure. 8 million Americans plus. Okay. But here was the establishment bailing out the banks who I will prove, not me just alone, but caused all the problems. Okay. So that was George W. Bush. You want to know betrayal? So let's tally it up. This is a fiscal conservative. This is a social conservative who betrayed Christians, using them as a tool. Total contempt. David Crow goes back to the community. Just distraught over the fact that there's no integrity, there's no real commitment to Christian values there. Okay. Fiscal policy and fiscal record. A complete anathema. You explode government, Homeland Security Administration. You explode government, $1 trillion boondoggle with Medicare Part D, right? You bail out the banks. All of this anathema if you're a fiscal conservative, and you double the federal debt. That's the record of George W. Bush. Okay, so catastrophic betrayal on the conservative side. Catastrophic betrayal under the Clinton administration on the progressive side. Because again, he's the white working class. What did deindustrialization, what did NAFTA and globalization do to the white working class in the United States? To the working class in the United States? Oh, deaths of despair. We will talk about that. Okay, that's Bill Clinton. But here comes Yes, We Can. Here comes Yes, We Can. Oh my God. Obama ran. How did Obama present himself? Obama presented himself as only in America can a biracial man, working class, rise up to get some of the best education in the country, to have a chance to be president of the United States. A biracial man whose middle name is Hussein. Only in America could that happen. So this is a man using that kind of imagery. and saying, yes, we can. If I can do it, you can do it too. Look at me. We're doing it. And we believe that shit. We did. So January 20th, he already bailed out the banks. But okay, maybe he had to bail out the banks because of what would happen if they did all collapse. But let's see what he's going to do for us. We elected him, right? So January 20th, he takes the office. And you got Americans protested in front of AIG. You know why? AIG was the biggest insurance company in the world. Right? But AIG went bankrupt. And you and I, the federal taxpayer, bailed them out to the tune of $180 billion. Yeah. So we owned AIG for a little bit. And then the issue came up. Why did AIG go bankrupt? Well, I give you a tip. Because the investment banks who had misrated the mortgage-backed securities that had crashed the global economy and the home market, the housing market in the United States in particular, that the ones who knew that the securities were misrated took out credit default swaps. Yeah, the things that Bill Clinton made legal. Credit default swaps with AIG, saying in the event that this AAA rated mortgage-backed security actually defaults, and AAA rated is the safest security, it's the US Treasury like, that AAA rating. In the event that this thing defaults, you need to pay me the face value. So no one buys insurance on AAA rated securities because AAA rated securities had never defaulted in US history, okay? But a few banks just happen to hold billions of dollars in insurance against AAA rated securities. You think that that would be a clue that someone knew that they were not really AAA rated risk? Because they paid millions of dollars, millions, maybe billions of dollars on premiums. Well, millions of dollars in premiums, probably some hundreds of millions of dollars in premiums, because Goldman Sachs by themselves had a $20 billion claim that was to be paid by AIG. $20 billion. Consider that. So Americans, because we're not stupid, are out there with the placards in front of AIG, appealing to the man of the people. Yes, we can. To say, hey, listen, if the pensioners who used to pay $2,800 are now getting $1,200 and we haven't bailed them out, the pensioners have to take a shave because the pension managers invested in those AAA securities that turn out to be junk. There is no way. Now that the federal taxpayer has stabilized AIG, that you're going to use our funds, the $180 billion, to turn around and give Goldman Sachs $20 billion when they're the ones who introduced the AAA rated security to the rating agencies in the first place. They caused the damn problem, right? We were smart enough to say no. And you would think our man of the people. Yeah, he stabilized Goldman Sachs. They didn't fail. He stabilized the banks. They passed TARP. Okay. You would think that he would say, yeah, accountability. They got paid for those securities that failed, right? Why should they get 100 cents on the dollar for the insurance policy when the insurance company went bankrupt themselves? The only reason the insurance company was viable is because we bailed them out $180 billion. So why should they get 100 cents on the dollar? That's obvious, right? Our man of the people, just like Bill Clinton, just like George W. Bush, said, oh, there's nothing I can do. There's nothing I can do. I have to give Goldman Sachs. I have to pay 100 cents on the dollar. Yeah, I know. For you pensioners, what can I do? But for Goldman Sachs, oh, of course, we can't interfere with that, right? And he didn't. And they paid $20 billion to Goldman Sachs. And while millions of Americans were losing their jobs, their houses, their credit, their families, their retirement savings, the college fund, all that stuff going, in 2009. And if you lived through it, you know what I mean. Goldman Sachs was fat because they got $20 billion and they paid out the highest bonuses in their history. Yeah. Thank you, Barack Obama. But he's just getting started. He's just getting started. Okay. So this is him coming in. So Barack made certain promises. He made certain promises. Right. Right. Healthcare was a big one. Now he was never a fan of single payer. Okay, fine. But he ran to say that yes, we would do, we would have a public option. We would do a program that we'd use competition to control private sector costs for health insurance by coming up with a not-for-profit public entity that could provide insurance at government costs. And that if the private sector wanted to participate in health insurance, they'd have to compete against that. It's called a public option. We had 60 votes in the Senate and we had the majority of the House. Okay. That level of support in the Democratic Party was used to pass the Affordable Care Act, which, right, had no public option, was an idea that Mitt Romney first put into use based on work from the Heritage Foundation, a conservative think tank, right? Right. When Mitt Romney was the Republican governor of Massachusetts, okay, our man of the people, instead of giving us at least a plan with the public option so that the cost of premiums could be managed because they would have to compete against this not-for-profit public entity, right? Oh no, that was out of it. We come up with the Affordable Care Act, right? That the insurance industry supported. They sure did support it. And the reason why is because they were scared of single payer and they were scared of the public option, which would have gutted their profits. So they loved this Heritage Foundation idea that got reframed as the Affordable Care Act, and off to the races. That was Obama there. Obama ran as a man who understood that the climate crisis was serious, and that we had to do something about it. So he ran saying that he would pass a cap and trade, which is a mechanism that encourages private sector entities to minimize their greenhouse gas emissions by purchasing carbon credits. It was a system of using economics to encourage, so the credits would go towards renewable energy, things that would reduce greenhouse gas emissions to cover for or to offset the emissions from heavy fossil fuel companies, right? Okay. No, we didn't pass that. We didn't get that, right? He promised that he would codify Roe v. Wade because, I mean, it had been 30 years plus. Reagan had campaigned on appointing judges to overturn Roe v. Wade, right? So Republicans, this has been multi-generational for Republicans. We're going to overturn Roe v. Wade. So Obama said, no, well, we're going to codify and protect. Yeah. Nothing. Right. Okay. I mean, okay. Then it came down to, well, okay. We had millions of Americans devastated by the Great Recession, by the financial crash, by the, okay. Someone must be held accountable. And Barack Obama and his sham of an attorney general, Holder, said, well, there's nothing we can do because everything they did was legal. Well, okay. Let's say, even if that was true, and it's not, But let's say it was true, right? He could have at least admitted to the American public the reason why it was legal was because Bill Clinton made it legal with the Commodities Future Modernization Act. He could have pointed that out. No, oh no, oh no. Because Bill was over there making all that money through the Clinton Global Initiative paid for by Wall Street, who then turned around and did this to all of us, right? Okay, no, Obama can't do that. Okay. But if you go into the Google or if you talk to your chatbot and you say, tell me about William K. Black, you're going to find out that he may be the greatest banking regulator in US history because that man put more bankers in jail for the S&L crisis in the 80s, right? than any regulator in US history. Okay. And here to tell you and explain to you exactly why. Even though the regulations that would have made the financial instruments illegal were no longer in place, and so therefore they were technically legal because they didn't violate certain regulations, that Wall Street had made promises that everyone relied on that they knew weren't true. And the proof of that, for example, was the fact that they were buying insurance for the safest investments in history that no one had ever done that before. And they were paying tens, hundreds of millions of dollars for those premiums for years because they knew that the AAA rated securities were not truly AAA risk. Okay? So we could have prosecuted them, and this is what William K. Black will tell you. We could have prosecuted Wall Street using the RICO laws, conspiracy to commit fraud. And oh, what a conspiracy it was. But no. Well, Barack Obama looked into the camera and just said, there's nothing I can do. It's all legal. Man of the people. He continued George W. Bush's escalation of the forever wars because he escalated the war in Afghanistan. Now, we hadn't gotten bin Laden. W. Bush hadn't gotten bin Laden. But when Barack came on national television that night and announced that they captured and killed bin Laden in Pakistan, but okay, wouldn't you have thought that the wind down would start? Oh, no. No, because this was never about that. We just need an excuse to go to war. Because this is about the forever wars. Because they're making money. They're making money with these wars. Right. Okay. So he captured and killed bin Laden. And the war on terror didn't end. No, because it's never supposed to end. And so the war in Afghanistan went on and ultimately was fought for 20 years. Now think about that. The Taliban were running Afghanistan when we went to war in Afghanistan in the beginning. And when Joe Biden pulled us out of Afghanistan after 20 years, the Taliban was still running Afghanistan. Our tax dollars trained a 600-man military, Afghan military. And we invested nearly $1 trillion in arms. And they handed over those weapons within weeks of us walking away. Our soldiers served for 20 years. I'm a veteran. My heart breaks for the fact that they served for 20 years. Experienced things, unspeakable things. And it did nothing. It did nothing. The only person, the only source who benefited from 20 years in Afghanistan is the military industrial complex. And oh, just so that you know, most of the military industrial complex is owned by BlackRock. Just like 95% of all securities in the major exchanges are owned by three entities, including BlackRock. State Street. You know, I won't go on. My point being is that Barack Obama continued this. He didn't end the war in Afghanistan when bin Laden was captured and killed. We didn't wind it down. We continued it. Oh, and we had to look for more. So then we entered the war in Syria. And to give you an idea of how it doesn't matter who we work with, because it's all about the perpetual war. Our ally in trying to overturn Assad in Syria was Al Qaeda. I can't make this up. Go look at Tulsi Gabbard's confirmation hearing for the director of national intelligence, and she will explain. This is why she ultimately got run out of the Democratic Party, because she couldn't endorse, as a combat veteran who joined because of 9/11, the idea that we would ally with Al Qaeda in order to overthrow Assad. This is Barack Obama. Okay, escalating the forever wars. But it doesn't end there. Barack Obama's Assistant Secretary of State is a woman named Victoria Nuland. And she was in charge of Eastern Europe. And in the beginning of February 2014, she was caught on tape. She was caught on tape by the Russians talking to the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. And she was telling the U.S. ambassador in Ukraine, we are about to install a new government in Ukraine. And here are the names. Okay. At the time when she said it, the government of Ukraine was democratically elected. And they were NATO neutral. They had a mutually beneficial economic relationship with Russia. Their economies were integrated. And it was working for both of them. And they were NATO neutral. But we didn't want that. We wanted them to join NATO. So we were participant in the overthrow of the democratically elected government of Ukraine under Barack Obama in 2014. And I point you, and the link will be in the notes for this call, for this episode, to the speech by Jeffrey Sachs to the European Parliament, the EU Parliament, in February of 2025, explaining how he was in Ukraine because the Ukrainian government, the new government that we installed, right, needed his advice on how to unwind the economy from Russia, because they were anti-Russian, right? And so they needed his advice because he's the leading developmental economist in the world, right? So he was there, and he left. And the reason why he left is because when he got on the ground there in 2014, he found out that we had financed the violent overthrow of that democratic government under Barack Obama. So fast forward to the war in Ukraine, okay? That should give you an indication of how this was not an unprovoked attack by Russia against Ukraine. But okay, but this is Barack Obama. So he accelerated. The number of people he killed with drone warfare dwarfed George W. Bush. This is Obama. Okay. So that was Barack Obama's administration. Okay. And that's what led to in 2016, these two administrations to the election of Donald J. Trump. So now I've just given you the Clinton administration, I've given you the George W. Bush administration, I've given you the Barack Obama administration that led us to elect Trump. And and so all I'm saying, and Trump is his own animal, but he got elected because the American electorate were done with the establishment. If you look at the primary season in 2016, the Republican field had very good historical Republican candidates. John Kasich from Ohio, Jeb Bush from governor, was a great governor of Georgia. I mean, of Florida, right? So John Kasich was the budgetary person in the Congress that helped Bill Clinton reduce the deficit to a point of surplus and was paying down the debt. That was his claim to fame, working with Democrats as a fiscal conservative Republican. So this was a credible Republican. And the Republican electorate, Trump shredded them. Why? Because the adults in the room had betrayed the Republican electorate. And the interesting thing about it is the same thing was happening over on the Democratic side. If you look what the Democratic electorate was doing in the primaries, Bernie was hot, white hot. But the Clintons had the fix in because the Clintons got the DNC to agree. They had super delegates, which is like 600 delegates, which are politicians essentially and different dignitaries within the Democratic, political sphere, who got to be delegates as individuals. And so the Clintons made a deal through the DNC that that any superdelegate who committed to Hillary before the Iowa caucus, before the votes started, and stayed with her throughout the entire primary season through the convention, that in the general election fund, that the Clintons would split the general election fund with those superdelegates who also running for re-election. And so if you go check the numbers, 95% of all superdelegates before any votes, before Bernie had a shot to show that he was going to be a real challenger to Hillary, were already committed to Hillary Clinton and stayed with her, even in states that Bernie had blew her out. Welcome to a banana republic over in the Democratic side. So, okay. So this is how the Democrats prevented the Democratic voters from voting for the only anti-establishment voice in the Democratic side, is that they rigged with the superdelegates, right? To favor Hillary. And so dead-aired, completely ridiculously stupid, the Democratic Party put up the most establishment Democrat, Hillary, against Donald Trump, who was running as an anti-establishment, candidate. So how does a billionaire be able to sell to the American public that he's anti-establishment? Because he's running against Hillary Clinton. You can't get more establishment than Hillary Clinton, right? Okay. So there we go. And so in a very controversial election, in terms of vitriol and all that, we elected Donald Trump. The problem is that Donald Trump wasn't expecting really to win. He had never been president before. So by the time he actually won, and he had those few months before January 20th, 2000, what, 16, 17, whatever is, okay, to take office, he had to put together a government, and it is thousands of appointments. So what had happened is, even though he ran as an anti-establishment, make America great again, right? He criticized the Bushes, said that he said that the Iraq War was the worst foreign policy debacle in U.S. history, breaking Reagan's 11th commandment, that Republicans don't criticize Republicans. Here was Donald Trump You talk about why MAGA loves him, because he says the truth, a truth that other politicians won't say. And he doesn't always say the truth. In fact, yes, I agree. Most things out of his mouth is not true. But the few things that he says is true is the kind of truth that politicians don't say. Like, isn't it self-evident that the war in Iraq was the worst foreign policy debacle in U.S. history? But no one had said that. So this, okay, so, okay, but the problem is, all right, so he got elected as an anti-establishment guy, but he didn't have anyone to, he didn't have a team. So he had to rely on the usual suspects who had all the experience in the Republican Party. They were the neocons. And so the neocons took over Trump, in his first term. He was hindered by the Russiagate controversy, the idea that the Russians had influenced the election and he wouldn't have won without Russia. So there was a lot of things he couldn't do because of that. And the neocons, who were the establishment Republicans, right, were basically running his administration because he had no other talent that he could draw on, who was ready to step into government, who knew where the bathroom was. Okay. So most of his first term, Trump governed like a traditional conservative Republican, not an anti-establishment Republican. His only two major pieces of legislation was the 2017 corporate tax cut, okay, which was a massive tax cut where the top 1% got an average benefit of about $60,000, and the median person in the country got a benefit of about $600. Just say it, right? That's a traditional trickle-down economics tax cut type piece of legislation, right? And then the CARES Act, which absolutely it gave the pandemic unemployment insurance $600, and the PPP program for small businesses. Yeah, those programs lasted till August and then expired. But then it turned around and gave the Federal Reserve the ability to lend $4 trillion to the large multinational corporations. And so by the end of 2000, right, 30% of all small businesses in America failed and never opened again. Anyone who earned $27,000 or less had lost 10 million jobs. Anyone who earned $60,000 or more had their jobs back and were making that money again, right? Billionaires had increased their net worth by $1 trillion. Okay, the actual economy contracted 3.5%, which was twice the Great Recession. But Wall Street blew up because the Federal Reserve injected $4 trillion, right? And so how did the stocks do? With the real economy contracting, the Dow Industrial Average went up 7.8%. The S&P 500 went up 16%. The Russell 2000 went up 18%. And the NASDAQ Composite went up 43.6% at a time that the actual economy contracted at a level that we hadn't seen since 1935. Okay? Trump governed like a traditional Republican. The wealth got really wealthy and did really well, and everyone else got screwed. Okay, that wasn't the anti-establishment Trump. But then, we had enough of that. So we elected the adult in the room, the old man, Joe Biden. Barely, but we elected him. Shenanigans. Once again, the Democratic electorate wanted Bernie Sanders. And let's don't get it twisted. Bernie tied Pete Buttigieg in the Iowa caucus in 2020. He won the New Hampshire primary, and then he blew out the field in the Nevada primary. And that's when the Democratic establishment panicked. Bernie's running away from this. They had South Carolina, and then they had the big Close to South Super Tuesday. And Barack Obama got on the phone. And this is where we go back to the banana republic. Forget about American democracy. Barack Obama got on the phone and convinced Pete Buttigieg, who was number 2 in delegates, right behind Bernie Sanders. And Amy Klobuchar, the senator from Minnesota, was number 3. convinced them to drop out of the election and throw their support to Joe Biden, who was in fourth place. But convince Elizabeth Warren to hang in there through Super Tuesday. Why? Because she's the only other progressive vote. So let's split the progressive vote, consolidate the establishment Democrats behind Joe Biden. Now, just think about the level of narcissism it takes you to run for president of the United States. Could you imagine, if we ever experienced it in US history, that someone like Pete Buttigieg, who was number 2, someone like Amy Klobuchar, who was number 3, would drop out after like 3 primaries, 3 contests? They're just getting started and they're right in it. Would drop out to throw their support to someone behind them? The fix was in, and this is how they defeated Bernie this time. Okay, so now we got Joe Biden. He's supposed to be the adult in the room. He promised us he would only run one. He would restore normalcy, restore sense making in government and stuff like that. Here we go. All right. And what did Joe Biden do? I mean, I cannot express this enough. He started off, okay, before he raised his hand, on inauguration day, there was 2 runoff Senate seats in the state of Georgia, right? Okay. So two senators. But the thing about it is that if the Democrats won both those Senate seats, they would have a 50-50 tie in the Senate, and the vice president would decide to cast the deciding vote. And that would give Joe Biden a Senate majority, and he already had a House majority. And so he could govern. So he went down to he went down to Georgia. And Georgia hadn't elected a Democrat to the Senate since Sam Nunn in the 90s. So let's understand context. He promised, they campaigned hard during the special election in the month of December before Joe Biden got elected. And they promised, they had bulletin boards. If you're from the state of Georgia, write it in the comments. You saw it too. They had bulletin boards. If you elect these 2 senators, I will approve a $2,000 COVID-related aid package to the American people. Just elect these 2 senators, and then we'll get it done. Okay. And Georgia did the unthinkable. They elected both those 2 senators. And you know what Joe Biden did? He approved $1,300 and took credit for Donald Trump on the way out the door did a $700 package. He took advantage for Donald Trump's $700 package and only gave the American people $1,300 after he promised. Okay. He promised that he was going to raise the minimum wage. The minimum wage hadn't been raised for like 20 years. He was going to raise the federal minimum wage. He allowed a determination by the Senate parliamentarian, which is an employee of the party who has the majority of the Senate. Okay. He allowed the ruling of the parliamentarian, which basically said that the legislation that would have raised the minimum wage was non-budgetary. And as a result, meant that in order to pass it, it needed 60 votes to end the discussion. They couldn't pass it on a straight 50+1 majority, like other budgetary matters. And he let that be the excuse for not raising the minimum wage. Oh, I would like to raise it, but the parliamentarian. By contrast, I assure you, when it's the Republicans, they would replace the parliamentarian. We'll get someone who sees it the right way, because the parliamentarian works for them. Biden promised to forgive student loan debt. Student loan debt has exceeded credit card debt in the United States. It is an albatross around the neck of American students for the last 20 years plus. And Joe Biden ran in a close election to forgive a good portion of student loan debt. And so he was advised how to do it. The original authorizing legislation in the 60s that created The student loan program gave the Secretary of the Department of Education the authority to forgive debt. Instead of using that authority to forgive the debt, Joe Biden uses the COVID-related emergency authority. And he was advised by his own advisors that that was very shaky constitutional grounds. And so what happened? The U.S. Supreme Court said, no, you can't do a permanent forgiveness. The amount that was being forgiven was permanent on the basis of an emergency authorization. You either need new authorization from Congress, or you need to rely on the permanent authorities you do have, which he did have from the Department of Education original student loan authorization from the 60s. Okay, so he got shot down. Take note that he didn't go ahead and reload and rely on the authorization that his advisors told him to. Why? Because he just wanted to look. He just wanted to look like he was going to do it. I tried to raise the minimum wage. The parliamentarians stopped me. I tried to forgive student loan debt. That bad Supreme Court stopped me. When he had the actual authority to do it. Okay, this is Joe Biden. This is the adult in the room. Okay. As bad as George W. Bush was, as bad as I showed you Barack Obama was, for the entire time that they served, inflation wasn't a thing. I'm serious, 2 to 3%. Inflation wasn't a thing for the 2000s. We will talk about this in its own episode, but inflation exploded under Joe Biden and peaked in 2023 to 9.1%. Okay, what did Joe Biden do to help the American public who was suffering under the weight of inflation that hadn't reared its head in decades? Well, he let the child credit, there was a child tax credit that was really helpful for American families. He let it expire. Didn't reauthorize. Did no new major initiatives to help the American public face a level of inflation that hadn't been in America in 30 years. But at the same time, go check your Google, go talk to your chatbot. He was running around the country, or his people was running around the country in 2023 talking about Bidenomics and how this was the greatest economy, and that he was the second coming of FDR. Oh, yeah, okay. That we're not done with Joe Biden. Then, right? I told you Obama was involved in the overthrow of the Democratic government, the democratically elected governor of Ukraine, that he was involved in installing an anti-Russian, pro-neutral, pro-NATO government in Ukraine. Okay, so now it's 2022, and the Russians have their military on the border. Biden knows what was going on. He was the vice president under Obama, right? Instead of negotiating, when Putin sent a communique to NATO in December 2021 to say, can we have a summit on the security question of Ukraine joining NATO? Okay. And Biden sent back through the NATO Secretary General that it is not the business of Russia where NATO expands, even if it's to the Russian border, where, oh, by the way, we forward position nuclear weapons. We do it right now. Okay. So it's not their business. Okay. So this is the basis by which Russia attacked Ukraine. It's because we influenced the government of Ukraine. We paid for the violent overthrow, installed an anti-Russian government, and started to build bases. It was on the front page of the New York Times. We started building secret bases, NATO-grade weaponry in Ukraine on the Russian border. Would that be considered against our national security if someone did that in Mexico or Canada? Okay. But what did Joe Biden do? He said he gathered the international community to impose the worst sanctions that any country, not even South Africa, got the level of sanction that Russia got for attacking Ukraine because we were violating their national security by trying to get Ukraine to join NATO. Okay, we will have an episode discussing, fleshing all that out. My point is that Joe Biden led us right into that war. Talk about the forever wars being continued. Yes, let's go to war with Russia. Why not? 120, 125 billion dollars later, 4 years into the war in Ukraine. And oh, by the way, NATO is losing. Ukraine will lose to Russia. But our money is well spent. And BlackRock is booming because of it. Right? So that Joe Biden, right? But then Hamas attacks Israel on October 7th, 1923, right? And kills 1,100 plus Israelis, slaughters them, takes 252 hostages, and Israel decides there are no innocent Palestinians in Gaza because they elected Hamas. No one mentioned that it was in 2005 and that the average Palestinian is under the age of 18. And so therefore, very few of the population of Palestine in Gaza actually have voted for Hamas in 2005. But here's the point. That was the basis by which Israel is killing and slaughtering anyone and everyone in Gaza, right? And is currently being prosecuted for war crimes, for genocide, by the only authority who has the treaty, who has the jurisdiction to prosecute a genocide, and that's the International Court of Justice. Now, the thing about Joe Biden in this incident is that Joe Biden knows that the Genocide Convention is the controlling document to determine who is committing genocide, and that this document was first written in 1947 and ratified in the United States by the senior senator from Delaware, I think in 1988, right? He led the ratification of the Genocide Convention in the United States. And this document is only 4 pages long. I will have the link for you, the PDF in the notes. So he knew that this is how you define genocide, that it's the International Court of Justice that defines genocide, that South Africa had brought the case against Israel, that Israel is defending themselves, and that the court has made several rulings which strongly suggest that they're going to find Israel guilty of genocide. He never mentions the Genocide Convention. He never mentions that, in fact, because it's against U.S. law. First and foremost, we ratified the Genocide Convention, which means under U.S. law, you have constitutional law, then you have treaty law that you've ratified, then you have federal law, then you have state law, then you have municipal law. So this is the highest level of law below the Constitution is the Genocide Convention because we ratified it, and U.S. law expressly states, federal law, that the United States cannot sell weapons to also militarily support a country engaged in human rights violations, and they are guilty of the crime of crimes. There is no human rights violation more severe than genocide. He knows it. He's a lawyer. Well, listen, who headed the Senate Judiciary Committee, who led the ratification of the Genocide Convention, and he never bothered to mention that this is going on, right? Because the only story he says is that it's absurd that Israel is committing genocide because they're only defending themselves, and they have a right to defend themselves, knowing damn well that there is no self-defense for genocide. There is no justification for genocide. This is not murder. Murder is different. Murder is awful. But genocide is killing everybody of a particular group intentionally. Everyone dies. The babies die. Everyone, right? It's the crime of crimes. There is no justification for it. But that's the primary excuse they give to justify why it's not in violation of US law. It's absolutely it's law. And that's Joe Biden. That's Joe Biden. Okay. So this is the four establishment presidents. This is what the people who are supposed to be the mature, the establishment politicians, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Joe Biden. You wonder why we elected Donald J. Trump after we elected him the first time? Why we elected him again? We elected him again because Joe Biden and the Democrats and the establishment from both the Republican and the Democratic parties did the unthinkable. They made Donald J. Trump the lesser of two evils. It's just factually true. That and I covered it in my first episode. The idea that every major demographic of the United States, ethnic, gender, age, all of it, regional, battleground states, all of them trended to Donald J. Trump. Thin, but all trended towards him. Right. That tells you that the broadest consensus, maybe in U.S. history, but certainly since the 1984 landslide election of Ronald Reagan against Walter Mondale, voted to reject Kamala Harris, to reject the establishment because of the level of betrayal that they have bestowed upon the American people. And that if you want to complain, why Trump? It's because the Democrats refuse to let an anti-establishment voice get to the general election. As I explained, how they stole the election from Bernie Sanders twice. Now, what would have happened to the general election would have been great to see. That's what the American public deserved. But if you're going to tell the American public who've been betrayed for 30 years that your only choice is to continue the people who betrayed you, and Kamala said, what did she say? I can think of nothing that I would have done differently than Joe Biden. If you're telling me that we have to vote for the people who've betrayed us again, or Donald Trump, and you want to say, well, he's this and that and other, and he said, grab this by the, no, he's never done to us what the adults in the room have done to us, the magnitude of betrayal. And that's your breadcrumb for this episode. So how did we get here? We got here because the establishment political parties consistently have betrayed the American public over the last 30 years. The establishment parties are owned by extreme wealth. And that the American public is done. And they elected Donald J. Trump to dismantle a US government that is not serving the American public. And it's not. And it hasn't for a long time. Pick an agency, any agency, and then check how the American public is doing and tell me that the US government has been serving the American people, that the Department of Defense is serving the rank and file military, 20 years in Afghanistan, and nothing has changed other than the sacrifice of our young men and women in uniform. Yeah. So that's your breadcrumb. America has spoken. And no, we know he's tearing it down. And while many of us would have preferred the Bernie Sanders version of the political revolution, welcome to the party. And the people who are complaining the most are the people who actually benefited from the establishment betrayal of the American middle class, of the American working class, of the working poor, and of the indigent of this country. And shame on them. But I stand with MAGA, MAHA, and the American the disenfranchised American middle class and working poor and indigent in this country. And I hope you do too. So this was a long one, but we came through a lot to get here, and we can never forget. And if we don't take the wisdom of what we have learned through this process, we will not find our way out of the hinterland. Because this is, none of us listening to this thought that this would be the country we would live in 2025. Well, if we want to get America back, we must pay attention to how we got here. We must hold people to account for what they did. We must stop honoring people who have lied to us over and over again and start coming together and building the country of the people, for the people, and by the people. Thank you. This is episode 3 of Breadcrumbs, a podcast for people who know it's not working. Thank you for your time today. I know it was a long one. Hopefully you find it worth it. You take care.